To summarize Judges and Ruth into one sentence, we could say that it is the Lord's discipline and providence. Joshua was about the attitude of accompanying the Lord, whereas Leviticus was about the eligibility to accompany the Lord. Numbers was about the method to accompany the Lord, and Deuteronomy was about the principle to accompany the Lord. Since Torah was the textbook on accompanying the Lord, Joshua was a workbook to exercise the textbook. This brings us an important spiritual message on the saint's attitude to fulfill Jesus' command and enjoy our privilege given by him. In spite of all this education, the Israelites disobeyed the Lord. Therefore, the Lord needed to discipline them through a new way. Judges was about this story. Ruth was an example of how we should trust in the Lord and the Lord's providence for his people. Let's review them one by one. Frame of Old Testament. Follow this sequence: ages, leaders, key places, keywords, national perspective, and authorities' perspective to the genealogy of Jesus. The book's allocation and their representative triplets, the spiritual perspective of prophets, and lastly, BC and Adam's Chronicle. Please open your Bibles to Exodus chapter 12, verse 40. Now the length of time the Israelite people lived in Egypt was 430 years. Since the entering into Egypt was in 2238 of the Adam Chronicle, the year they came out of Egypt was 2668. The time background of Deuteronomy was in the 40th year after they had come out of Egypt. Joshua was the story from just after Deuteronomy to the completion of the conquest of the land, but chronically we need to consider the end of the conquest age as the death of Joshua. It was presumed that the Israelites took just 6 to 7 years to conquer the land, when led by Joshua, as stated, chapter 14, verse 10. So here I am today, 85 years old. When Caleb conquered Hebron, which was the last battle, as written in verse 15. Since Caleb was 40 years old when he explored the land in Kadesh at the second year after the exodus from Egypt. If Joshua was the same age as Caleb, the Adam's Chronicle of the book of Joshua was 2740. If he was 10 years older than Caleb, it would be 2730. Therefore, the time of the beginning of Judges varied. Anyway, considering the time in trouble and peace described in the book of the period of Judges' age would be at least 390 years. Let's have a look at it in detail on the slide of the 12 Judges background. Old Testament and the book of Samuel. Before taking a look at Judges and Ruth, it is helpful to review the relationship between Deuteronomy, Joshua, Judges, Ruth, and Samuel. Actually, these books tell the story of the time from Moses to David, who were spiritual leaders of the Israelites and were favored by the Lord. This review brings us a new idea of Judges and Ruth. The major characters of the book of Samuel were Samuel, Saul, and David. Let's see the relationship between the first 4 books and them. Let's first see the topics of each one on the right side. Hannah, his sons Joel and Abiazar, and prophets were keywords for Samuel's story. Saul's subjects were the Lord's glory, the necessity of a king, and the fulfillment of the prophecy. David's role, political background, and his spiritual legitimacy were supported by those books. As stated in 1 Samuel chapter 3 verse 20, all Israel from Dan to Beersheba recognized that Samuel was attested as a prophet of the Lord. And Acts chapter 3 verse 24, indeed all the prophets from Samuel on, as many as have spoken, have foretold these days. Samuel was called as a prophet through the Lord's promise as written in Deuteronomy chapter 18 verse 15. Of course, there are different opinions in interpreting a prophet as seen in Deuteronomy chapter 18 verse 15. Here we take the thought that it was the representative of the general prophets because of Deuteronomy chapter 18:20, but a prophet who presumes to speak in my name anything I have not commanded him to say, or a prophet who speaks in the name of other gods must to put to death. Therefore, we presume that it would be all the prophets from Samuel to Jesus. Samuel was born through Hannah's sincere prayer and performed well as a prophet, but he failed to educate his sons Joel and Abijah. Their wicked deeds invoked the Israelites to ask for a king. But the book of Judges and repeatedly implied that this request of a king was, in those days Israel had no king. Everyone did as he saw fit, as stated in chapter 21-25. From a spiritual point of view, this was the fulfillment of the prophecy as stated in Deuteronomy chapter 17 verse 14. When you enter the land the Lord your God is giving you, and have taken possession of it and settled in it, and you say, let us set a king over us like all the nations around us. Who was the first king of the Israelites? Saul. Why did the Lord choose Saul as a king? Where was he from? Which tribe did he belong to? He was a Benjamite. The Benjamites had fought against the remaining tribes of Israel and had almost been killed. Only several hundred had survived. The Lord chose Saul from the Benjamites because it was the smallest tribe. Now let's see the story of conquering the promised land in the book of Joshua. Joshua had failed to complete the conquering of the land. Later, David completed the task by conquering Jerusalem. The remaining lands to conquer became a political background for David. The story of Ruth was a support to David's legitimacy. In conclusion, the books of Deuteronomy and Judges supported the origin of a king for the Israelites, and Joshua and Ruth supported the background of David. Three pillars. The Lord had given the Israelites instructions on how to be holy in Leviticus and how to live with the Lord in Numbers. Moses gave the Israelites instructions on how to live in the promised land. Joshua gave us instructions on how to live after our salvation. It helps us realize the difference between salvation and a blessed life. When I say Judges, what comes to mind? Many people say that Judges was about the cycle of people's disobedience and the Lord's redemption through his love. Have you heard of this? Many people highlighted God's abundant love for the people in spite of their repeated sins. Of course, this is right, but today I want you to take a different perspective on this book for more grace in your Christian life. It might be your first time hearing this and might find it strange. Please remind yourself of the reason for the 40 years in the desert as stated in Deuteronomy chapter 8 verse 2. What was it? It was to humble the Israelites and test them in order to know what was in their heart, whether or not they would keep the Lord's commands. In connection to this, we need to understand the Judges. In other words, we have to find the reason why the Lord allowed the cycle in spite of the fact that he could stop it at once or lead the people his way through his almight and show his love in a different way. Therefore, we can presume that there must have been another reason for the Lord to repeat the cycle for them. What was it? Did you find it while you were reading Judges? Is there anyone that got to it? Open chapter 2. This is an important chapter to get the answer to that question. First, take a look at verse 10. After that the whole generation had been gathered to their fathers, another generation grew up, who knew neither the Lord nor what he had done for Israel. How were the Israelites? They didn't know the Lord. This was the origin of the book of Judges, I think. Please circle and underline this verse. There was the other interesting reason as seen in verse 3. I will not drive them out before you. There will be thorns in your sides, and their gods will be a snare to you. The Lord didn't drive the Canaanites out of the land. It was not Joshua but the Lord, because it belonged to the Lord. Why didn't the Lord drive them out? Because they made a covenant with the people of the land, as stated in verse 2. Therefore, the Lord wanted to teach the Israelites who he was and discipline their generations to come by using the Canaanites in the land. The Lord repeated the cycle for this discipline in order to teach them who he was and for them to obey him. In other words, 4 lessons of FWLS. Do you remember this? Fear the Lord, walk in his ways, love him, and serve him. Do you agree with this view? If you don't agree with this, please carefully take a look at verse 22. I will use them to test Israel and see whether they will keep the way of the Lord and walk in it as their forefathers did. This was the foundation of the book of Judges. Since the Israelites didn't know the Lord, he used the Canaanites to repeatedly discipline the Israelites for around 390 years. The book of Judges was the story about this. In this context, let's see the 3 pillars of the book. It is TRE, test, repeat, and examples. Test was the base of the book. Repeat was the structure of the cycle, and there were 2 spiritual and physical examples in order to demonstrate their representative faults. Let's take a look at the details one by one. Number 1, test. The Lord kept some Canaanites in the land to test the Israelites. Let's see who remained there at the time in the next slide for a minute. Slide remaining Canaanites. Chapter 1 began with the remaining Canaanites in the land. Take note that this was just on the left side of the Jordan River, the promised land. There were 8 tribes in the land, excluding the Reubenites and Gadites, who were on the right side of the Jordan River. Which tribe was missing from the list on the left side of the Jordan River? It was the Simeonites. Why were they left out? It was because the area allotted as their inheritance was a desert, as per Jacob's curse of their dispersion through the land, stated in Genesis chapter 49, verse 7. The Canaanites repeatedly harassed the Israelites, which was foretold in Numbers chapter 33, verse 55. But if you do not deprive the inhabitants of the land, those you allow to remain, will become barbs in your eyes and thorns in your sides. They will give you trouble in the land where you will live. The Lord always prepared a device to redeem them. It was to raise a judge to save them, as stated in chapter 2, verse 16. Number 2. Repetition. There were some repetitions in Judges. The first repetition was about the cycle. The cycle was repeated only 6 times in spite of the fact that there were 12 judges. Each cycle had 6 steps: disobedience, punishment, appeal, raising a judge, redemption, and a period in peace. Let's see why there were only 6 cycles against the 12 judges on the other slide. The second repetition was about the spiritual messages of judges. The spiritual message from each judge was repeated. 6 messages were comprehensive and the remaining were very simple. Let's review them on the other slide. The third repetition was about the key phrases. The Israelites did evil in the eyes of the Lord was repeated 7 times, but the ones related to the particular judges were 6. The other phrase, "In those days Israel had no king," was repeated 4 times between chapter 17 to 21. From a spiritual point of view, the king probably represented the Lord, who was their God. They didn't consider the Lord as their king because they didn't know him, as stated in chapter 2, verse 10. In addition to that, it probably also represented an actual king of a country. Number 3, examples. The book of Judges ended with 2 incidents as examples in order to educate the Israelites not to betray the Lord. Both of them were about adultery. One was about the spiritual adultery, and the other was on the physical adultery, respectively, of the Danites and the Benjamites. The Danites were deprived of an idol that Micah had made on their way to a place to conquer. After they settled into the place, they served it. In consequence to this, its name disappeared from the Bible, as seen in Revelation chapter 7, verse 5. The last record of the Danites in the Bible was the story about Samson, who was a Danite. Let's see Jacob's 12 sons in the slide of Jacob's blessing. Slide Jacob's blessing. First, let's memorize the 12 sons. The first 4 sons were from Leah, who was the first official wife of Jacob. They were accustomed to us: Reuben, Simeon, Levi, and Judah. Then Rachel's servant Bilhah gave 2 sons, Dan and Naphtali. Just we can call it DN. It was followed by Leah's servant Zilpah. She also bore 2 sons, Gad and Asher. Just ZA. Leah gave 2 sons again, Isaac, Issachar, and Zebulun. Lastly, Rachel, who was the beloved wife of Jacob, gave 2 sons, Joseph and Benjamin. The first 4 and the last 2 were easy to remember, but the 6 sons in between were confusing. You can memorize it as DN is JB. Let's see the distribution of their inheritance on the map in the slide of inheritance. Slide inheritance. The first one was for Rachel's sons, who were located in the center of the land, and Leah's sons surrounding them. Bilhah's sons were to defend the north, and Zilpah's sons were located in the north and east. Let's go back to the previous slide. Slide 13, Jacob's blessing. Jacob cursed Benjamin as a ravenous wolf, as stated in Genesis chapter 49, verse 27. It was probably because his mother, Rachel, had died at his birth. This is just a guess. It is very hard to find any other reason from the Bible. In the end of the Judge age, the Benjamites had fought against his brothers and was almost killed. Only hundreds of people survived. But the Lord chose a king from the Benjamites, Saul. But Saul finally became a ravenous wolf, pursuing David as per Jacob's curse. Let's go back to the previous slide of the three pillars and see Benjamin's wickedness. Chapter 19 began with a story about a Levite and his concubine. They visited the Benjamite town and she was killed by bad Benjamite characters. The Levite cut her body into 12 pieces and sent them to all of Israelite tribes. Since the Benjamites didn't repent, the Israelites, except the Benjamites, had fought against the Benjamites and almost killed them. But at the first and second battles, the Benjamites defeated the alliance. As stated in chapter 20, verse 21 and 25, because they asked the Lord in ego-centered ways as written in chapter 20, verse 18 and 23, before attacking the Benjamites. What was their ego-centered prayer? They didn't ask the Lord whether or not they should attack the Benjamites. They decided to attack by themselves and asked the Lord who would go as stated in chapter 20 verse 18. The third battle, Phinehas' prayer, was different from the earlier ones as seen in chapter 20 verse 28. He asked the Lord whether they should attack the Benjamites or not. After they got God's approval and they attacked the Benjamites as stated in chapter 20 verse 28 and defeated them. We have to pray to the Lord like this. We should not pray in an ego-centered way. Thank you for watching.